We have here behind us a monument to the Russian Liberation Army at the cemetery in Prague, and when newspapers write about this monument, that's usually where they leave off. But in reality, I want to talk a little bit more about the role of Vladimir Boyarsky, who is buried here alongside these Vlasov army members, because he has a separate story that runs parallel to their own. Like many generals in the Soviet Union, he saw the toll that the Great Purge took on the upper leadership of the Red Army, and when his division was encircled in 1942, he immediately told the Germans that he wanted to work with them, not to perpetuate the Holocaust, although that happened, but to fight communism. And a short while later, Andrei Vlasov made a request to form the Russian Liberation Army, but the Germans allowed Boyarsky to continue on with a separate partisan unit of pro-Axis Russian partisans. His unit, the Russian National People's Army, was made at the request of a white Russian immigrant living in Connecticut of all places. His name was Anastasy Vonsyatsky. He was the son of Russian nobility, his father being killed by a Jewish anarchist in Poland. And Vonsyatsky was an incredibly ruthless person. He would walk around even in America with a swastika armband on, and as a Russian at the height of the early war. He worked very closely with the German-American Bund, and so Boyarsky eventually came to command his unit, and it could be conjectured it would be more or less against his will how that command was carried out, because before he was commander, he was immediately put into a prisoner of war camp for Russian officers in western Ukraine, and then the Nazis put him in command of this new unit at the request of essentially a National Socialist Russian who lived in Connecticut, who sent a sort of emissary over to Berlin. And to mention a little bit more about Boyarsky's Russian National People's Army, it was formed, yes, at the request of Anastasy Vonsyatsky, but he sent over this emissary named Sergei Ivanov. And the man who signed off on this request, because most of the German high command under the Nazi leadership viewed the Russians as subhumans, the man who signed off was Claus von Stauffenberg, who was instrumental. He was the leader of the July 20, 1944 plot to kill Adolf Hitler in his wolf's lair. This plot failed, and Stauffenberg was very unfortunately executed. So this unit, as opposed to Vlasov's army, which by many accounts was sort of formed of people who joined the unit to escape the prisoner of war camps, it seemed like Boyarsky's unit was formed of people who were enthusiastic volunteers against communism, and they operated, as far as I can understand, mainly out of Belarus. Now, because of this incredibly high rate of defection, in 1943, Boyarsky was arrested and put into an internment camp, but very quickly was released and joined forces with Andrei Vlasov, who had formed the National Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, which reflected a deeper political aspiration. It was only around 1944 that the upper leadership of the Nazi Party began to talk about giving some political power to their allies in Eastern Europe. But because of this, many people in America working for the intelligence services figured that men like Boyarsky and men who worked within these units would be good intelligence assets, because some of these units were just anti-Semitic, some of these units were just opportunistic, but some units seemed to actually be anti-communist, which is, of course, exactly what the intelligence services were looking for in the aftermath of the war. However, for many of the men who fought for these units, especially under the Russian Liberation Army, the patch being right here, they were caught in Prague during the Prague Uprising. A lot of the men in the Russian National People's Army were moved over to Western Europe and the Western Front. Many of them actually came to surrender to the Allies, to the British and to the Americans, and would find their way to America after the war, or to Western Europe to live as sort of refugees and anti-communists. But Boyarsky was ordered to go to Prague on the eve of the uprising. And because of this, the uprising had occurred, and on his way to the city, he was captured by Soviet partisans. They disarmed him, and he walked up and said, "I want to talk to your leader." When they refused, he slapped the lower-ranking commander in the face, and he was executed on the spot. Now, because these hundreds of men were executed in the outskirts of Prague, their bodies were later collected after the war and buried here in the cemetery for Russian Orthodox people in Prague. the Nazis told the SS to destroy the city so it couldn't be used by the advancing Soviet forces. It was instrumental in their production, their factories, and the Russian Liberation Army in the city was ordered to turn the guns against both the Nazis and the SS and the Soviets, and to attempt to surrender to Allied forces to the west. This happened, but the Allied forces, even though they welcomed them in to their camp with open arms after the Russian Liberation Army tore off their Nazi insignia, they turned them over to Soviet forces immediately, and they were executed. In fact, Vlasov, who commanded the Russian Liberation Army, he tried to escape the city on the back of a truck rolled up in a carpet, but he was eventually captured. And there was a debate for years over what exactly happened to him in the aftermath of the war, but it was revealed that he was hanged from a meat hook in Red Square. And this monument is right next to the Russian Liberation Army monument and the grave of Boyarsky. It says, "Mass grave of unknown soldiers of the White Army who left Russia in the early 1920s and died in the Czech Republic from injuries and illnesses received during the Civil War." This was prior to World War II. These men were fighting in the interwar years against the newly established Soviet Union. And some more White Russian monuments. You've got this one, which is now unreadable, covered in kudzu, with a grenade built into the top of the monument. This one with a Russian nautical flag on it, which later came to be used by the Russian Liberation Army. The monument to the soldiers of the White Russian armies during the Russian Civil War, and the two monuments to various officers of the Russian Liberation Army, the Russian National People's Army, who died in the Prague uprising.